Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this Trobe Asia online panel discussion that's presented in partnership with the Australian Institute of International Affairs and China Matters on the topic of a recently published policy research report, China's Antarctic Ambitions and Their Implications for Australia. My name is Nick Bisley, and I'm the Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences here at the Trobe University. I'm also a member of China Matters Advisory Board, and I have the pleasure of moderating our panel discussion today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we all meet today. I'm here on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any First Nations peoples who are joining us today. Today, we're talking about Antarctica, a continent in which the question of sovereignty is a crucial one, as we'll discuss. And I think it's important to reflect as we're paying our respects to traditional owners that sovereignty was never ceded in the lands on which we meet. Also, many of us will be joining from across Australia and indeed many parts of the world. And I would encourage those who'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which they're based to use the chat function to do so. So I'm delighted that so many people are here to taking part in this discussion. We had over 240 registrations. Obviously, with COVID and various other things, we probably won't get the full 240, but it's a testimony to the interest of the topic that so many people have signed on. Now, today, I'm joined by three people who bring diverse expertise and experience to the discussion on this topic. First, I'd like to welcome Ms. Yun Jiang, the inaugural AIIA China Matters Fellow and the author of the report. That is jointly published by China Matters and the Australian Institute of International Affairs. Yun has actually visited Antarctica some years ago as a tourist, and some of her brilliant photography is embedded in the report. To give us a view from Beijing, and I would emphasize a view from Beijing on the topics that Yun raises, is Dr. Mengye Liu, Associate Professor at the Yong Pung Ho School of Law at Singapore Management University. Mengye has published extensively on polar issues and brings his expertise to bear. And our third panelist today is Mr. Richard Maud. Richard is Executive Director, Policy, and a Senior Fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute. He's previously had a long and distinguished career in government. And when he accepted this invitation, Richard did emphasize he is not an Antarctic specialist, but will comment on Yun's report as a foreign policy expert and will provide a view, again, with an emphasis on a view from Canberra on the issues that Yun raises in her report. Now, in Australia, we tend to hear about Antarctic matters only sporadically. When it comes to the actions and intentions in Antarctica of the People's Republic of China, there is, like most things China-related, a range of, pardon the pun, polarizing opinions. So this report provides a really good overview of the key contentious issues and brings an interesting perspective to bear on these topics. In terms of the running order, we'll start first with Yun to provide us with the overview of the main arguments in her report about China's Antarctic ambitions and what they mean for Australia. Then I'll ask Mengye and Richard each to comment before we begin a bit of a conversation with all three panel members. Each speaker has around 7 minutes to present, and I will try to keep a somewhat iron fist on the time, given that we only have an hour in total. And in the final 15 minutes or so, will be open for the audience to pose questions to the panel. If you have any questions, please submit these through the Q&A, not the chat function. I'll be monitoring the Q&A function, the Q&A section to curate the questions to pitch to the panelists. And ideally, it'd be great if you could point out which panelists you'd like to direct your question to, or to all three. We will finish promptly at 3 p.m, so that may mean we're not able to address all of the questions. But without any further ado, Yun, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I am speaking to you from today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. And thank you to Nick and Mengye and Richard for joining me for launching the report. Now I'll share my screen. Let's see, where is it? Here it is. So why Antarctica? Well, As Nick mentioned, I traveled to Antarctica about 5 years ago as a tourist. And as a part of that trip, I actually had the opportunity to visit one of the Chinese research stations on Antarctica. It was quite an interesting trip. But Antarctica actually touched on so many different issues. It's not just geopolitics or military. There's international governance issues, there's resources, fisheries, environment, climate change. So there's a variety of issues involved when it comes to Antarctica. And of course, Australia has a very close connection to Antarctica. We're one of the earlier countries to explore Antarctica. And we're quite influential on Antarctic affairs. Of course, we're also a climate country as well. But it is an overlooked region generally. The media attention has been sporadic, but usually when it does happen in the context of China and Antarctica, it is about China's increasing power. And where there is media attention, of course, there's a tendency towards some of the alarmist reporting on China. Here are some examples. There is an aircraft carrier apparently going towards Antarctica, which is, you think, why? All right. Because I know that a lot of people here today probably are not Antarctic specialists. So I think I'll start off with some scene setting. Antarctica was first explored at the end of 19th century, often called the heroic age. Many of the explorers are very well known today. You know, we've got Shackleton, and there's the photo of Mawson there. The streets in the Canberra suburb of Mawson are all named after Antarctic explorers. It was seen as testing of limited human survival, like later on climbing Mount Everest and the race to space. Now, Australia claims more than 40% of Antarctica, which you can see there on the left. And Antarctica itself is actually bigger than the Australian mainland as well. So the claim, Australia's claim is actually 80% of the size of Australian mainland. So it's a very, very, very big size. The claim was passed on to Australia from the UK in 1933. So originally it was a UK claim, and then there was a federation, and that was passed on to Australia. But only 4 countries in the world recognize Australia's claims: United Kingdom, New Zealand, France, and Norway. Basically, it's a mutual recognition. The Antarctic Treaty came into force in 1961, and as part of that, all parties to the treaty agree that no new claims can be made. Under the treaty, claimant countries and non-claimant countries enjoy similar rights and privileges. For example, non-claimant countries can build research stations on territories claimed by another country, and that has happened a lot. China is a relative newcomer to Antarctica compared to Australia. Its scientists only traveled to Antarctica from 1980s, and they acceded to the treaty and became a consultative party, which gave a say about governance of Antarctica only in 1985. And here you see some photos I took of the Great Wall Station, which is the first station built by China on Antarctica. And there is a note written by Deng Xiaoping there as well. It's also important to note that only 29 countries out of approximately 200 countries in the world are consultative parties. So only 29 countries have the power to basically make decisions on Antarctic governance. And this is in the map. So that's basically all the green and red they don't have any decision-making power when it comes to Antarctica. So that's most of the world. That is all the pictures I have to share. And now you just get to see me talking instead. Let me just make sure this is okay. So my report examines China's ambitions and activities in Antarctica. I found that much of the concerns and worries in public reporting about the PRC in Antarctica is overstated, especially with some of the sensationalist reporting on territorial claims and militarisation. I think this is because many reporters and commentators tend to transplant China's behaviors and activities from one region, such as South China Sea, to Antarctica, despite the different context. On Antarctica, I argue that China is only a middle power, not a great power. And so the tactics it uses is different. And of course, its aims in Antarctica is also different to its aims elsewhere, such as in South China Sea. The main interests it has in Antarctica include development, security, and international governance. Under development, gaining access to resources and strengthening its science and research capability help its economic development. For military, Antarctica hosts receiving stations for China's Beidou satellite navigation system, just like Antarctica also hosts receiving stations for US-owned GPS and the Russian GLONASS as well. And of course, climate change is a national security issue for almost all countries. And Antarctica is crucial in that. Just shrinking ice sheets lead to rising sea levels, which threatens coastal cities everywhere. On top of that, China is a consultative party in the Antarctic Treaty, which means it participates in decision-making on Antarctica, and its behavior there will be seen by other countries as well. As a middle power, China is more favorably disposed to rules and institutions. As a middle power on Antarctica, that is. It is more favorably disposed to rules and institutions such as the Antarctic Treaty. And that's especially since it does have some decision-making power since it signed the treaty. So it is part of this exclusive club of 29 countries that have decision-making power. So of course, it wants to continue that. And all signs pointing to want to continue. After all, it is unlikely to benefit if the system falls over, since it is not the dominant power on the continent. But China wants more say on Antarctica and wants its interests more reflected in negotiations. From its perspective, it is quite frustrated that it is not more influential in Antarctic forums as it is elsewhere. And this has caused tensions. Where this tension is manifested and disagreement is most intense and potentially difficult to resolve is the different countries' respective approaches to Antarctica. Now, China has a very strong development focus where potential access to resources such as fisheries is quite important to it. For Australia, preserving the environment in its pristine state is more important for us. And decision-making on a lot of issues on Antarctica is by consensus. And China has been willing to block progress even when it is the sole opponent. The development perspective it holds, unfortunately, is not as prominent as in the Antarctic Treaty members as it is perhaps in the broader international community, because consultative party members tend to be richer countries. So it is harder for China to really garner support for a lot of what it wants to do. But despite these difficulties and disagreements between Australia and China, I argue that there is still scope for cooperation that will be beneficial for both countries. I listed two in my report. One is on logistics, specifically resuming port visits to Hobart, and the other one is scientific cooperation. So I will leave it here as an overview of my argument in the report. Thank you.
Thanks, Yun. Nongye, the floor is yours to give your response to Yun's comments and report.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Nick. And hello, everyone from tropical Singapore. I think this event proves my long-lasting interest in Antarctica after all these years talking about Antarctica, especially when I traveled to Tasmania again and again and again. So based in Singapore is a I mean, I just came here recently. I had quite a kind of interesting experience already because people probably know that Nancy Pelosi just left Singapore for Taiwan today. So, I mean, I think just to follow up what Yun mentioned, when we are trying to understand the Chinese policy in Antarctica, I think there are two kind of overarching guiding principles just to bear in mind. The first one is everything is domestic. I mean, China is huge. China is, to some extent, China is very much like the United States. China is a huge country where everything for the Chinese policymaker is domestic. And second is the Chinese system is a very much a top-down system. I mean, top-down, I mean, really the top-down from the presidency and then to the ministry, different ministries, and then to the state, to the provincial level, and then so on. So after talking about China and Antarctica for all these years, I've been in this webinar, I've been trying to thinking about where does this all begin? I mean, the thing is, China has been in Antarctica for more than 40 years now, and but this apparently becomes a very significant media topic in Australia over the past years. And I trying to look back, and I realized probably 2013 is a turning point, because 2013. So presidency took office in 2012, and in 2013 he kind of publicly raised his signature foreign policy Belt and Road Initiative. So that is something very broad, but also that is also a kind of a signature policy in a way that this is a new administration, and then he wants really to push his own agenda. So everything seems to start from there. So to me, it seems that every ministry has its own KPI to implement this kind of a broad strategy. So then when it comes to Antarctica, which is managed by State Oceanic Administration, then you will see that that was a year when Chinese delegation suddenly started proposing to establish a ASMA, the Antarctica specially managed area around the Kunlun station. That is the Dumei, the highest point of the Antarctica ice sheet. And also that is also the year when Chinese delegation became very vocal and openly opposing the marine protected area proposals in Kamala. So everything seems to start from there. I think it's that is from that turning point. I think that then this question that I have been asked again and again, what is China's interest in Antarctica? I mean, kind of popping up. So, I mean, with this question, behind this question, there is a very kind of a genuine, I would say, genuine anxiety from, let's say, the Australian policy community about what the hell is going on. I think that's pretty much the kind of trying to understand this kind of a very polite question. What are China's interests? I'm not going to touch upon that question today, because I think in Yun's report it has been comprehensively covered. But what I really just want to point out is, if you really want to understand what are China's interests in Antarctica, there is a very kind of similar narrative that is pushing by China in many parts of the world. I mean, in the decision and lawmaking process, such as the Arctic, such as the deep seabed mining regime, such as the high sea governance, the BBNJ negotiation, and including the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting, the AIIA system. That is what is called the balance between use and protection. So sometimes use is ahead of protection. I think in Antarctic context, protection is ahead of use. But what do they mean by balance? I think nobody knows. It's kind of a very subjective term, and also the question here is who determines the balance, and I think that's where we see all these kind of positions in the Kamala MPA discussions in particular, and also another issue that Yun also touched upon in her report is China wants to have a bigger say. I mean, this is also nothing new because this also falls into the general narrative that China has. I think this really dates back to the decolonization time, that it just wants a fair and just international system. So I mean, this is even published in China's Antarctic activities. That white paper China presented to the world in 2017 when Beijing for the first time hosted the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting. So then people may ask, what do they mean by a fair and just international system? Once again, it is also very subjective. Like, what do you mean by just? And who gets to determine that? But anyway, I think I will just stop here with one last thing to I think raise some people's interest is China's Antarctic law. The official name is China's and Chinese. I think it's the law on Antarctic activities and environmental protection is being drafted during the term of the 13th Standing Committee of the People's Congress. That is, the term is between 2018 and 2023, which means by next year, China will have its domestic law on Antarctica. It has already been determined that this law will be made during this term. So I think that will be a very good kind of indicator to answer or to further kind of elaborate above two questions, like what do they mean by the balance between protection and use, and what do they mean by a fair and just international system in that text. But it hasn't been published yet, so we don't have any further news. And I will just stop here. And thank you.
Nangua, thank you. I'm disappointed you don't have a crystal ball that can tell us what the Party Congress law is going to be, but we can speculate when we get to the Q&A as to where it might go. Richard.
Thanks very much, Nick. Well, just at the top, let me say that, like Yun, I'm in Canberra, and so I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Ngunnawal people, and also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Secondly, congratulations to Yun on the publication of this report. It's a great read. I think this is a really terrific subject to be grappling with because it's a nice little case study of the role that China currently plays in the international system and the role it might play in the international system in the future. And I think it's also, I mean, one of the great tricks, of course, from a Canberra perspective in getting China policy right is trying to understand Beijing's motivations and then trying to work out, well, what is it that we really should be worried about, and what is it that we shouldn't be worried about and that we can pay less attention to. And that's sometimes hard to get right, as we've seen over the past couple of years. You asked Nick for a Canberra perspective, so I just wanted to do a couple of things. One is to think about why Canberra pays a lot of attention to what China's doing in the Antarctica, and then to focus in on one national interest at stake, which is the health of the treaty system. So I think the reality is that whoever is in government in Australia is going to pay a lot of attention to China's activities in Antarctica for a few reasons. One, of course, is there's a fairly significant trust deficit in the relationship at the moment, and that's going to be hard to overcome. Second, the global context is important. We're, of course, in an era of very sharp competition between China and the United States, and between China and close partners of the United States. The third subject of interest of Canberra, of course, is as Yun's paper shows, a lot of China's Antarctica infrastructure is within the Australian claim. Fourthly, as Yun points out in her paper, Australia does place a lot of store on the overall health of the Antarctic treaty system, and on particular on conservation in that area. And there China has been at best a delaying and often a blocking party, as Yun says. I don't think any of that rules out the possibility of continuing to work with China on Antarctic matters, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Yun raises a couple of other possible concerns for Canberra in her paper. One is the issue of possible militarisation of Antarctica and the use of dual-use technologies and/or PLA personnel in the area. I agree with you, not as you kindly pointed out, that I'm an expert on this matter, but I think there doesn't seem to be sufficient evidence for Australia to be unduly worried at this stage, although we should keep a careful eye on what happens in the future. And I also agree with Yun that there's no evidence, I think, that China is in any hurry to make its own claim of sovereignty in Antarctica. So that brings us to the health of the treaty system, and the main issue at the moment, the main rub point, is the differences on conservation versus resource utilisation. And I think Yun covers these issues pretty well. It's worth noting that even in these early days, Tanya Plibersek, the relevant new Australian federal minister, has recommitted Australia to pursuing the East Antarctica Marine Protected Area, and that's one of the ones that China has blocked and delayed on. So that presumably will continue to be a point of friction between China and the new Australian government. What do we make of China's motivations here? Well, again, Yun and also Yang Ni have covered this pretty well. It seems clear, I think, that China wants at least to keep open its economic options in Antarctica, and they're in the main fishing and tourism. But I don't think China wants to close off the future possibility of seabed mining if at some point it decided that made sense. And then I agree that what we're also seeing in the treaty system is a China that globally is trying to assert more influence in the multilateral system, as we just heard, in the name of a more just or equitable system. Of course, one problem, at least seen from Canberra, is that when China talks like that, it really means a system in which it gets its own way, as great powers want to do. So asserting itself in the ATS is entirely within that objective. I do think there are some risks here that it's worth teasing out a little bit more. Yun begins this discussion, but I think we could go a bit further. And so a couple of risks, I think, from a Canberra perspective are that we begin to see a permanent division in the ATS on this issue of conservation versus utilisation. Australia would not want Kamala, for example, to become, in fact, an agreement that protects the right to fish rather than one that enshrines a responsibility to protect and conserve. Another would be the emergence of blocks within the ATS system, a bit like we see in the UN system more broadly, which Australia has been anxious not to see. Some have worried, for example, about the emergence of a permanent fishing bloc where countries would vote as a bloc on ATS issues. I think another risk, and I find this an interesting one, is that China increasingly comes to self-define what compliance with the ATS looks like. And by all accounts, from some of the people who follow this issue closely and from reports out of ATS meetings, China has already begun to do this to some extent. And I agree with Yun that we should really resist parallels to the South China Sea. The two situations are totally different. But if there was one possible comparison, this one might be it. That is, that China defines for itself what compliance with the international law that underpins the treaty is, because by definition, whatever China does is correct, and China therefore must be in compliance with the law. And if that came to a major issue of compliance and China simply asserted that it was in compliance with the law, as it has done in the South China Sea, then that obviously would be very corrosive. And then just a couple of other things. These are, I think, medium to longer term issues about the treaty system. They're entirely hypothetical. They may never come to pass, but Canberra does think about them. One is that at some possible point in the future, China might see advantage in seeking changes to the ATS, to the treaty system that Australia might or might not agree with. And it's worth noting that both the main treaty and the Madrid Protocol that governs minings have review functions embedded in them, although the mining one is not due for some time. And as Yun notes in her paper, it's almost impossible to overturn the mining ban from within the treaty system. And then lastly, again, hypothetical, I don't think this is likely at any time in the foreseeable future, and it may never happen, but we couldn't rule out the possibility that if China saw it in its own interest to do so, that it could leave the treaty system entirely. And this is not, I think, just something that, slightly harassed foreign policy officials worry about. The very eminent Australian international lawyer, Don Rothwell himself, in writing on the 60th anniversary of the treaty, noted that one couldn't be complacent about that sort of outcome, and that there are other examples in history where states have established international legal frameworks to unilaterally pursue their interest and or to set up parallel bodies. So those are, I think, the main issues at stake for Australia from a national interest perspective in the treaty system. What do we do about all that? I like the fact that Yun has some policy recommendations in her paper. I think it remains very strongly in Australia's national interest to preserve the treaty system and to keep China within it. And it's possible, not certain, but it's possible that at some future point those two objectives might become incompatible. But I don't think that we are at that point yet. Protecting the treaty means doing the things that we've been doing as a nation a little better in recent years. That is, trying to reinvigorate our science, to rebuild our capability, to refurbish our infrastructure, to invest in the science. I agree with Yun that it's worthwhile exploring opportunities for bilateral cooperation. There are some differences here. There are some friction points, as we've discussed, but I don't see anything to be lost from seeing if there are areas of cooperation that are mutually beneficial. And then just as a last word, Nick, I don't mind Yun suggesting that we should appeal to China's better angels in the sense of its own emerging environmental aspirations and narrative. But I would caution against embracing the framework of a community of common destiny. That is, those kinds of concepts and China's language around them is not in our interest to have them begin to be embedded in the multilateral system, and indeed in other forums we fight quite hard to keep that sort of language out. So I'll leave it there, Nick.
Thanks, Richard. I think we'll get to some of these issues, particularly the kind of appealing prospect of the jiu-jitsu move of using China's rhetoric against it. But it is, as you point out, Richard, fraught, and I think there's one of the questions is touches on this as well. But before we get to that, I've just got a couple of things I might pitch to each of the panelists. Yun, might just start. Richard touched on this, as did Yun as well, is really around the Antarctic Treaty, and particularly you rightly, I think, point out that at the moment the PRC is keen for the treaty to remain in force, but it's also seen by many as a bit of a blocker and a country undermining consensus and destabilizing some of the norms around the treaty system. So what's your sense of how strong the system is, and how much of a risk is it that a country like China, a country of China's scale and reach and influence in the international system, continues to be, or is even perceived to be, a bit of a disruptor to the system?
Thank you. Thank you, Richard and Nongye, for your comments and insights. I will offer my views on this question. I think there is currently still a strong political will from all countries to keep the system going. Many countries are frustrated at the lack of progress on issues such as establishment of the marine protected areas. But unfortunately, like all consensus-based decision-making, these sort of things would always happen. In other international institutions where there are consensus decision-making, often parties do not agree as well. But that does not necessarily mean that the system will fall over. What is it? I guess it's useful to think about what is the potential alternative to the system. So if we don't have these systems, and I think Richard mentioned this as well, one is then to have no system at all. And second one is to establish an alternative, potentially a parallel system. But from China's perspective though, having no system means no progress will be made. And if it's blocking progress right now, then it's, I guess for China's perspective, it doesn't make much sense to leave the system because it can, within the system, blocking progress. Then why would it leave the system in the first place? But it is possible then for other countries who are more frustrated to leave the system. And I think that comes into my mind, example of the World Trade Organization, where the United States was very frustrated at China. It perceived China was taking advantage of the system, and then it blocked the appointment to the appellate body. And what has that led to is trade disputes being unable to be adjudicated. But in that case, trade was a very high profile issue for both China, United States, and most countries. Antarctica is not. And there is no point kicking over the system to score domestic political points like it would have for trade, because for trade, when you do that, there's a lot of domestic support for that to happen. But on Antarctica, there's not really a pressure point for that. And if there was no system at all, then even less progress will be made. It'll be very hard to agree on anything. Even if countries come together and decide to establish, say, a protected areas, then there will be an enforcement problem that will be even more difficult to solve than under the current system. So bearing in mind these two alternative scenarios, I think the likelihood is still for the system to continue.
Okay, just a second one for you, Yun, and this relates, I guess, to the sort of some of the more sensationalist reporting around, or the sort of alarmist responses to China's ambitions in Antarctica. I mean, I think you're right to say that, a lot of this is overblown and there's not a lot of evidence for it, and yet, you make clear in the report that the PRC has ambitions to be a great Antarctic power. And if that were to come to pass, surely other countries ought to be somewhat concerned about potential what that would mean, and the potential for bringing, force and coercion to bear. And as a consequence, is it not unreasonable for countries to be concerned now about that potential building up, and as a result, sort of try to position themselves accordingly, given that ambition that you flagged in the report?
Yeah, so China wants to become a great Antarctic power, but it is unlikely to dominate or control Antarctica totally. So even the United States, in its unipolar heydays, did not control Antarctica. And that's mainly for two reasons. One, the benefit of controlling Antarctica is rather small, even taking into account the mineral deposits there. On the other hand, controlling such a remote and hostile environment takes a lot of resources. And, as an economist, you always think, well, what's whether the resource can be better spent elsewhere. Countries do not have unlimited resources. When they spend more on Antarctica, they necessarily have to spend less elsewhere. And is Antarctica more strategically important for China than other regions that's closer to China? Probably not. So even if there was a great power, let's say war happening, why would China spend those limited resources on Antarctica as opposed to elsewhere. Now, if we expand the definition of coercion, then it may be different. So if we expand the definition to say, if we were talking about, putting pressure on countries, whether diplomatically or through trade and economics, then it's possible that China could use diplomatic pressure or other forms of pressure to incentivize the governments of other countries to change their mind about certain Antarctic issues. But it is actually more difficult on Antarctic matters than on other matters, mainly because the consultative parties is a closed club of 29 countries, very limited, and they're mostly rich countries as well. And usually in other international forums, such as the United Nations, China has been more effective at garnering support from developing countries to support its objective. And so it will be more difficult in Antarctica case, because the Antarctic Party consultative members are more developed and probably less aligned with China geopolitically as well.
Thanks, Yun. You touched on the balance between the classic kind of use versus protection that the PRC brings, its perspective it brings to the Antarctic, and Yun's report sort of describes at the moment there's a bit of a balance towards use versus protection. I wonder if you might just tell us a little bit more about the debates within the PRC about that, so the different views, and whether, how strong the voices are that are arguing for more protection versus less use, or the other way around.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I still remember very clearly when I was in 40th Antarctic Treaty Consultative meeting in Beijing. That was also my first time to attend ATCM. And so China organized, that is also kind of unprecedented. So China organized a kind of a working group meeting on a special workshop on use and protection in Antarctica. And following that, I can't remember it's before or following that, one of China's most prominent Antarctic scientists, Qin Dahe, so he was also invited to give a presentation. He talked for about 15-20 minutes purely about science. Didn't even mention a single word about youth. So I mean, that is a kind of very striking experience for me. So, and also a while ago, I conducted a kind of a literature review on the Chinese publications on polar issues, law and policy over the past 10 years. And you can see clearly that within the science and also social scientist kind of community, there are quite a number of scholars. They are more towards environmental protection. I think at the moment, the governmental, at the governmental level, and also this is also can be seen from the literature review, because those who are kind of close to the government, I mean, those who are even selected by government to represent China in the Chinese delegation to ATCM and Kamala, those people, they are more towards use, while I think the voice regarding the protection is there as well, and it's quite visible as well. But to what extent they can influence the decision making of the government, that's another issue, I think.
Yeah, it's a tricky question, that unpicking the black box of CCP decision making. Richard, I might sort of follow up on this particular line of thought. As you said at the end that you felt that using the PRC rhetoric around ecological civilization life was not particularly useful or shrewd for an Australian point of view. What do you think Australia could do to help convince the PRC to go down a more conservation, less use path in relation to Antarctica?
Well, here's where the limits of my knowledge of Kamala and the system come to play. But it's worth noting that the marine protected areas, the proposals don't actually ban fishing. And there have been previous examples where it's been possible to find an agreement on protecting certain marine areas that balance the interests of all parties. So I don't think we should give up on the possibility that we can, over time, find a way forward that would allow China to protect its own interests. As any country, it will pursue its national interests while still achieving the conservation goals that we would like to see. I think if China is prepared to enter in that kind of negotiation with good faith, and if all parties are prepared to compromise somewhat, since most multilateral negotiations are a compromise, everybody has to give up a bit to get something that's for the greater good, then it could still be possible. If China sees its interests as better protected by simply not allowing further marine protected areas, and there's no amount of endless negotiation that's going to solve it. But I think the jury is still out on that, so we may as well have a crack at it. And the essence is, I think, really less about the rhetoric and more about, is there a deal? Is there actually a deal here that can be done, even if it's imperfect, that balances the interests of the parties? And that's where very patient, clever multilateral negotiators take over, and flippity-gibbet foreign policy wonks like me offer encouragement from the sidelines.
Excellent. I like the idea of you as a flippity-gibbet, Richard. So we've got plenty of questions in the Q&A box, and we've only got about 13 or so minutes. So I'd like to turn to those now. And this one's from, actually, I'll start with my colleague, Dan Bray here at the Trobe, who has written a bit on Australia's Antarctic policy. And he's really pitched a question that I guess is for Yun and Nongye, which is really your sense as to how China's sort of evaluations, or China's sense of how Australia is approaching the Antarctic, and particularly he references aborted runways and recent proposals for new drones. What's the Beijing view, based on your research, of how Australia is approaching the continent? Nongye, do you want to have a first crack at that?
Oh, surely. So I think after watching this kind of microphones kind of diplomacy over the years, and I think when it comes to Antarctica, my experience is the Chinese media is very responsive. So I rarely see them really post an article kind of ahead of a Australian article. So normally it's and also that's quite kind of a similar to the Chinese foreign policy in the old days before the Belt and Road Initiative. It is very responsive. So normally what they do is like they see something happening, and then they just react with a kind of a reply or response. So when it comes to this particular issue about the runway, I think there was kind of a lot of suspicion around the building up of the runway. I mean, from the media pieces, or kind of used that as a way to justify the Chinese runway project. But I think after that it was aborted, then it's becoming very quiet. So I think that's probably is a good sign to some extent. Yeah.
And you?
Yeah, I haven't really looked into the runway issue in detail. Of course, I think the runway issue was much more significant in the Australian system than in the Chinese system, I suspect. But of course, the Australian system is much more open as well. So sometimes it can be harder to really gauge what the internal sentiment is in the PRC, unless it is written publicly through state media. But on the issue of what the Chinese government thinks of Australia's approach to Antarctica, I think there is a sense that Australia is part of this exclusive Western club, almost like a monopoly club, where we, along with a lot of other richer climate Western countries, come together, and from their perspective, we decide that Antarctica should be used for this specific purpose. And we do not take into account the perspective of perhaps developing countries, especially China. So I think there is a little bit of a resentment from China on that front. But there is also, from my readings, a lot of scholars who believe that there's a lot to learn from Australia as well. There's a lot of literature about examining Australia's policies, Australia's legislation on Antarctica, and whether China can learn from that. So that's also something quite positive about that.
Great. Well, I'm going to try and tie together a couple of questions that are about the Antarctic treaty system, and particularly the way in which the treaty system is tied to the territorial claims. A couple of participants have observed that the system supports the claims, and Australia's a claimant, and has some tensions with China's unease about territorial claims, the fact that it isn't a claimant. And yeah, the questions seem to, the issues that the participants are drawing on is, I guess, on the one hand, if you want to safeguard the Antarctic regime and you want to tie China's interest in it, would some kind of movement in relation to Australia's claimant stances help in that regard? That's one side. And the other side, just trying to scroll down to find the other aspect of the question. Yeah, and then more broadly, Harry Harding asks whether Australia's territorial claims gives it some kind of leverage. Is there room to maneuver in the longer run if you're looking to try to manage the system? I guess getting back to what you were saying, Richard, about the give and take of multilateral diplomacy, what part might territorial claims play in that longer run management of the Antarctic system? I might start with you, Richard, and then we'll kind of work back across the panel.
Yeah, well, my sense is that the treaty system actually, at least for the time being, serves China's interests here, because while it prevents China from making its own claim, it also prevents the current claimants from doing anything about theirs. So it's sort of like loaded guns at everyone's head. Nobody can move. And that was one of the core deals behind the original formation of the treaty. And to my mind, it's still a good deal. Australia still does take its claim very seriously, and that's one reason why the runway was sort of entertained, at least for a while, before it became clear it was just going to bankrupt everyone. And so, when you look at what successive governments have said about Australia's national interests, that they will list our sovereignty, right? But in effect, our sovereignty is null. As Yun says, a tiny handful of countries recognise it, the rest won't. So this freezing of everybody's claims, stopping new entrants from making claims, for the time being serves everyone's interests, including China's, I think. But it does mean that Australia doesn't really have any leverage, because we would never, I can't imagine Australian government giving up our claim. And then the only other thing I would say, I suppose, is just come back to the point I said right at the end of my remarks, which is that if at some point China decided it wanted to make a claim, that its interests were served by that, it would have to leave the treaty system.
Yeah, I think this is a very tricky kind of a question about the territorial claim and Antarctic treaty system. I mean, I guess my to be honest, I think at the end of the day, it is the best to just keep it low profile, to keep it low and leave it low. I mean, because the thing is, at least I think my understanding from the, as I mentioned before, from the Chinese practice in ATS per se, every time when there is something happening, then China kind of just responded. For example, one potential flashpoint. I think one attendee asked this question: what are the potential flashpoints? One potential flashpoint in the ATS is the establishment of the continental shelf. along, so from the Antarctic continent. So I think when Australia submitted its submission to the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea Commission on the continental shelf, on the outer limits of the continental shelf, based on its Antarctic territorial claim, I think China responded very kind of firmly and kind of very unpleasantly to deny this kind of claim. So the thing is, it is already frozen. So the best thing we can do, and we should do, is just to leave it as frozen as possible. Don't try to stir it up, because I think sometimes, especially in the past years, it has been stirred up quite a lot by the media reports, and of course it's not just media reports, to be fair. And I can see that in the ATCM and also especially in the Kamala meetings, because I observed the meeting last year, I can see that it became very tense between the Chinese delegation and the rest of the delegations. And there is a potential that, as Yun and Richard touched upon as well, like the Chinese and Russian delegations, they are not necessarily close allies in the Antarctic context, but I think now, because of geopolitical tension, and now they are getting closer, and also they share similar views. So and also the problem in the ATS is China does not have any other friend. For example, in the United Nations, China allies itself with a group of 77. So there are 134 developing countries to be allied with. While in Kamala and ATS, that's only Russia. So that is actually a potential kind of risk as well. And we have already seen that in the Kamala meetings, not in the ATCM yet.
Don't put the territorial claims in the microwave for defrosting just yet, I think. Yun, any final thoughts on this one?
I agree with what's being said. And yes, Antarctica is always a very productive sphere for bad puns as well, I find, or good puns.
Good pun.
So yeah, I definitely agree. Don't need to, yes, I think it'll be very difficult for claimant countries to give up their claims, totally. And certainly there has been a lot of other alternative models being pushed and examined previously. I think in the 80s, there was this UN trusteeship model, which was pushed by Malaysia, but this I don't think that's being considered as a viable alternative these days. And I think the best way forward for most countries believe the best way forward is to continue the current system. But on the other hand, we don't need to, continuously, I guess, stir up, as Nadia said, overly assert our territorial claims. So we don't have to go around and say, well, this is our territory, you can't build things here. Or it's not that Australian government does that. But again, there's sometimes it can be stirred up by, for example, media and other organizations. Or there's another interesting story of of Argentina and Chile trying to encourage people to go to Antarctica while they were pregnant so they can give birth there, just to apparently bolster their claims as well. I thought that was an interesting tactic. But again, those things, we don't need that. We can just keep as it is. I think that's the best way forward.
So we've got time for one final question. So quick responses from each of you, because I think this is a really useful and perhaps optimistic way of finishing things. And this is a question coming from Tony Press, and it basically makes the point that the Antarctic Treaty began as a disarmament treaty and has a strong emphasis on mutual assurance through open inspection and compliance reporting and so on. What can be done to build a stronger sense of mutual assurance in the future? So we might go backwards again through the past. Actually, Nungyo, you can go first, then Richard, and we'll finish with Yun, who's the author of the report.
Yeah, I think the best thing is just to do a good job. I mean, for every single country, including Australia, just to do what they can following the ATS. I think that's the best way forward. Everyone just does their job, and then follow the law, and with a belief, and then at least we also kind of create and maintain that belief that, yeah, this is it. Don't mess it up. I think that's probably the best way we can do, rather than trying to think about, oh yeah, how can we collaborate, where to cooperate. At least this might not be realistic anyway. So yeah, just quickly stop here.
Just be good. Thank you. It's good quality advice. Richard.
What the Americans might say, don't do dumb stuff. Look, the treaty itself, as the question says, does actually provide a great deal of reassurance within it. So, I agree that the key thing is to be treaty parties and operate with good faith and act in accordance with not just the law, but the spirit of the treaty. The only other thing I can think of is that a lot of people say that there needs to be more inspections done of bases and stations under the treaty. They're hard to do because they're costly. Of course, they carry risk to the people involved. And so they've only been done patchily, including by Australia, although we did do a string of them, I think in late 2019, early 2020. And so if people are looking for more assurance, then a healthy inspection system, which is treated in a non-defensive way by all parties to the treaty, could add some reassurance.
And Yun?
I agree with what's being said. I know inspection is one way, but it is costly. And if we want to, I guess, reassure certain segment of the society, if it becomes an issue, that is, if it becomes a bigger issue and we need to reassure certain segments of society, then we will have to put more investment into inspection and compliance. But other than that, how to do mutually assure, it's difficult because as we start off at the beginning of this discussion to talk about distrust, and it's very hard to go from distrust to trust, and we just have to take small steps, and not just on Antarctic issues, but also on other issues, because distrust between countries can affect between different forums and different issues as well. So we need to just build that trust over time in different international forums.
Thanks, Yun. I'm afraid we are, in fact, slightly over time. I said we'd be punctual, and I'm breaking my promise. A few just final things to say before we close off. Firstly, Yun's report, which I have a physical copy in my hands, which is very old-fashioned, can be downloaded from the China Matters website. The address is in the chat that Kate put up earlier, or you can just Google China Matters Antarctica report, because that's how I got it. The webinar is being recorded. We will send everyone who's here a link to the recording when it's available, and so please do pass that around. I think someone in the Q&A asked whether that would be made available, so do check that out when you have a moment. Finally, I'd like just to thank Dinah Heatherich and Kate Clayton from the Trobe Asia, and Linda Jacobson and Jeremy Stevens from China Matters for all their work in bringing this webinar together. A special thank you to Richard, Nungya and Yun, our panelists, for such an insightful and interesting conversation. And finally, thank you to all our participants for taking time to be with us this afternoon. Cheers, and we'll see you in a Zoom screen soon. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Hi, thank you.